Back again YouTube, and welcome back to the coding workshop. We're going to jump straight into part 2 of our PHP framework build, and a quick recap on where we left off last time. We sort of like initialized our project with Git and Composer. So this is where it's left off. I've not made any changes, but the first thing we're going to do in part 2 of this video is actually make some changes to our Composer file. And changes I want to add is I want to actually add autoloading. So I'm going to say autoload. I'm going to use a PSR4 standard, and the namespace that we're going to actually give our classes is Magma, because that's what we want our framework namespace to come under, which is Magma. And I'm going to have 2 backtick, and I'm going to point that to our source directory, which contains our Magma directory, which we have not created yet. So I'm going to say Magma. So let's actually create that now. So I'm going to show you a next way we can create files and directory, and that's within the terminal. So I'm going to say mk directory source and Magma, and you can just drag that into there because I need that Magma directory within that source directory. So the Magma directory is we're going to be keeping all of our core files, all of the actual files that builds up our framework, and it's going to all be put in there. So our next directory I need is tests. So and this is we're going to be keeping all of our test suites when we do come to create our unit test. But I'm going to actually create this directory right now. I'm going to call it tests, and I'm going to put an autoload dev autoload, which is going to point to our test directory, and give it a namespace of Magma test. So I'm going to say autoload the comma right there, autoload dev. Again, PSR4 and we're going to say Magma test, and we're going to point that to our test directory. So that's our main autoloading setup, because autoloading is what we're going to be using to load all of our internal classes, and this will also load any dependency class that our framework will rely on, which there will be a few that we're going to use. But a couple of stuff that I actually want to add in here as well. I want to add some PHP extension, because by default we don't know what environment you're going to be running your application in, and no environment might not be the same. For example, mine might have all extension enabled, yours might not. So we're going to add some extension that our framework going to rely on in order to actually work properly, because as I'm saying, not all environment is equal, and by we declaring that we need these extension, our composer will actually make sure that these are installed. And if we go to an application environment where they're not in, where it's not enabled, we are covering ourselves by putting them in our composer file that says whether you have it or not, we want these extension, and we're going to install them. So the first one is going to be extension, and it's going to be MB string when I can type. Second one is going to be extension PDO, extension JSON. You see some of these that some of them are recognizable and some of them aren't, and we know we're going to be using PDO and JSON, possible curl, and some simple XML, maybe not, but we're putting them in just because we might use them. And we got extension, curl, extension, simple XML. And we're also gonna ensure that we've got the latest PHP version. And at the point of writing this, my PHP version is 7.4.2 or 7.4.2. So we're going to declare that. And it's going to be 7.4.2 and caret 8.0, because PHP 8 is just around the corner. We're not far off PHP 8 release. Other bits that I want to add in this composer file is I want to add a support key. And that's going to contain some keys that points to some URL, and these are going to be coming from our GitHub page. So the first one is going to be issues, and I'm going to go to my GitHub account and I'm going to get the issues URL. So any issues will be listed on this GitHub page, and our project will just point directly to it. So I'm going to paste that in there. The second one is going to be the source, and that's going to be the source code for our project. Get that again. It's going to be code. Copy that. Paste that in. And the third and last one is going to be wiki. We'll come to add wiki. We're going to point directly to this wiki page on our GitHub, which is right here. Copy that. Paste it. Authors, I want to add a next key, and that's going to be the role key. I'm going to say the main developer or developer. What else can we add? That's important, or well, not important, but we're adding it. We can actually add a README file that we're going to link to at some point, and time that we will link to at some point. Also want to add some keywords, and we're going to add a couple. I'm going to say framework, say PHP and Magma core. Leave those three in for now, and that's pretty much our composer.json file for now. We'll add to it as we're building the project, and it will add to itself once we start installing dependency. So close this out for now, and I'm going to jump into my source directory, and I'm going to actually start listing some folders and directories that I know the project's going to need. So no need to worry about that bit for now. Each directory that we go in, I will sort of like explain to you what their purpose is and what their use case is in this particular project. So I'm going to sort of like do this in the terminal because it will be a little bit quicker. So I'm going to cd into source Magma, and that takes us straight into our Magma main directory. I'm going to start creating some actual directory that our files are going to be sitting in. So the first one I'm going to actually create off my head is we're going to need a database connection directory. We're going to need a session directory. We need a cache directory. We're going to need a collection directory, container. We need a base directory, and the base directory contains like our base controller class or base view class or base model class and stuff like that. What else we're going to need? I think a router directory and utility. So this is gonna all like utility classes, like, you know, we can put methods in, like common method in traits in PHP trait classes, but utility classes are classes that sort of like can justify being in a class by themselves. So I mentioned traits. There's going to be some PHP traits, and we're going to keep it purely object orientated. So trait classes are classes that we can use within different classes throughout our entire framework. So these are classes that's not, well, these are method within classes that is not related to any particular interface or classes. They're just common method that we can use throughout to, give us some service in terms of we can have a small method that does some converting of string. RESTful translation. We're going to be using Twig when we come to building our application. Twig is going to be a main part of our core functions, and that's how we're going to push application when it comes to using a front-end UI. When it comes to building out your HTML and CSS, we're going to use Twig to help us do that. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. And we got, what else? We got our config, because we're going to have some configuration file for our base or for our core framework, which we can then modify through our application configuration. And we're going to set it up to be overwritten by our application to allow application to adjust certain parameters of our framework. And we got liquid ORM, and this is going to be our very own simple ORM, or simple data layer or data access layer that we're going to use to actually interact with the database. So we're going to actually just run with that for now, and when it comes to mind, I'll add some more in. But this is our base directories that we're going to be working with from the get-go, and there's no particular order in how I go about creating these classes, because I'm trying to write it as loosely coupled as possible, so not too much is relying on too much. I'm trying to make it so it's a component base, and we pretty much can drop in and take out stuff as we go along. So we can pretty much just write this as we go. It will become a point where, for the most part, we're trying to make it as loosely coupled as possible. So we can actually start by implementing some of our routes. So I'm going to create a couple of files in here, router.php and router interface.php. And I also like to keep exceptions in all of my directories. So we got exception for each of our component, which will extend a base exception class which implements PHP exception. So we're keeping everything in place, everything separate, everything organized. So new folder, exception, and the first exception file we're gonna create is our router exception. Right. So our route class, our route directory, we're trying to make it so everything has got a single responsibility. So our router class is only responsible for taking that request that comes in and delegating the responsibility by creating objects or creating controller objects to handle those requests and send back a response. So that is all our router class is going to be doing. It won't be doing anything extravagant. It will simply take a request, create some object, create some controller object from that request, and let the controller deals with or handles that request and provide the response. So I'm going to use an interface, and the reason why I'm using an interface with this is so I've given myself the option to actually modify this later on externally, so we can implement this interface in a different class and actually rebuild the class, and it shouldn't really change the functionality internally. So that's my purpose of using an interface with this router. Or actually, it's going to be the purpose why I use interface throughout this entire framework. So it gives me the chance to sort of like extend the code externally, and it again, routers interface to provide blueprint, to provide structure, so your code is more readable, it's more maintainable, and it will be a good place to work because come 2-3 years time from now, we can easily extend, we can easily add stuff as we go along. So PHP, are we going to be declaring strict type in PHP because I want to type int and we want to make our class, we want to make this a very strictly type framework. Type int in, it helps with debugging, helps make our code more readable, and we're sort of like employing modern standards with PHP. And namespace is going to be, as I said, Magma, and we're in the router directory, so we're going to say router. And interface, and call it router interface. And again, I've used open and close curly brackets on separate line. That's also a PSR2, I believe, PSR2 standard. And that's pretty much all we're going to be writing our code in terms of our classes on our method. We're going to be implementing curly braces on separate lines. And the two method that we're going to start off with within this interface that our router has to implement, because our router is going to be implementing this interface. And the first method is going to be public. And also, guys, when you come in to write, when you write an interface, all method has to be public. It cannot be protected nor private like you can do in classes. Interface method has to be public. So public, and the first one is a function which is going to be add, and this is going to be void because the return type on this is void because it doesn't actually return anything. All it does is it takes a route in as an argument and stores that route within a routing table. So it's going to contain two arguments. The first one is going to be a string, which is going to be our route, and the second is an array, which is going to be the params or parameter. And the parameters is something that we're going to define, and it's going to be how we break our URL down or break our request down and store them within parameters. It will make sense when you start coding it. And I'm going to self-document because I like self-documenting. It's helped me. And I know there's a lot of like murmur around the web about putting documents in your code and it makes it look messy. For me personally, I'm going to do it because it helps me. This is my code base and this is how I'm going to do it. So add method, so say simple add a route to the routing table. And I'm going to declare the parameters. The first is a string, which is going to be route. Second is an array, which is going to be params. And as I said, this method return void. Still struggling with my keyboard. Still not got used to it. And the second method is the dispatch. So what the dispatch method does, it takes in the URL, it delegates part of it to a separate method which breaks it down and set the parameters. And but the main purpose of the dispatch is to actually create or control the objects. So that's what the dispatch does. So dispatch route and create controller objects and execute any default method on that object. Execute the default method on that controller object. So it's going to take one argument, which is a string, which is going to be the URL. And as I said, it return void. So it's going to be a public function and dispatch. URL. Let's say void. So that's the first bit of our interface that we have created. Now I'm going to go in the router class and I'm going to implement that interface. Again, declare strict, and declare strict is something that we have to declare on a file by file basis. There's no global way of doing it, just have to declare it in each file. Namespace, it is Magma router, and I'm going to actually explicitly bring my router interface in. I don't have to because I'm in the same directory. I can just implement the router interface, but I'm going to explicitly bring in my use case. So I'm going to say use Magma router interface, and say class router, which is going to implement that router interface, which is right here. And by doing that, what we're saying is that we are effectively signing a contract which says that we have to implement any method that is in that interface, and if we don't implement that method, well, the sky is going to fall down. Well, it's not literally, but it will just return an error. We'll just get an error. We just have to abide by that rule. And in our router class, did I spell that right? No, I didn't. This keyboard router. So I'm going to declare some properties, and these are going to be protected properties. So first is going to be protected, which is an array, and that's going to be our routes. I'm going to actually assign that to an empty array. Second one is going to be protected array, and we're going to call this params. That's also going to be assigned to an empty array, because this square bracket denotes an array. I could say that if I want, that is still the same, but I like using this syntax right here. And let's give it quick description. This returns an array of route parameters, and it's obviously an array. Same with this one. Returns an array of route from our routing table, and it's also an array. So a third property that I actually want to create, because what happens is when we got our URL, for example, I'm going to write a quick example right here. So we got a URL like this: localhost user, say index. What we're doing is we're not interested in the hosting part of the URL. We're interested in everything that comes after the first /. So if we get rid of that, what we're then doing is we're building some sort of structure. So if we can structure our URL, we know what to expect. So we can assign parameters to each of these strings. So the first string we can assign after the host name is our controller. So we can say user, that's going to be a controller. And then after that second /, we can assign the second string as our method. So if you get what I'm saying, we can call our controller class user and the method index. So that's just basic structure of how we're going about implementing our controllers. But what I want to do actually, because I don't want my controller to be called user, I want to suffix it with a controller string, which is what I'm going to do right here. So I'm going to create a next property, and this basically adds a suffix on to our controller name. It's just a basic string. It's going to be protected string. I'm going to call it controller suffix, and I'm going to say controller, because I want my controller name to be something like this: user controller. That's all I want my class to be called. So that's basically what this string is going to it's going to be concatenated onto our controller parameter and create this string that says user controller. Hopefully that makes sense. And so we're going to start implement the method, and the first one, as we say, is the add method. So I'm going to say public function add, and we have to implement it exactly the same way we implemented it in our interface. So we have to add the void as well, but unlike interface, we're adding the body. With interface, you don't add body, we add the body in the actual class that's implementing the interface. So we can say inherit doc, and what this little block does, it inherits the description that we've given it within the interface, so we don't really have to rewrite it again. And we're going to be adding in the arguments, which is route array, which is params, and assign that to an empty array. And all this is going to do for the moment, we're going to assign our route property to the route that's coming in. We're going to store the routes coming in into this array, routes array, or routing table. So this route, and we're going to equal that to the parameters that we set for that route. And that is the first bit of code for a routing class. The second one is dispatch, and again we're going to say inherit doc, because we've already written this doc in the interface, so we can inherit it. Public function dispatch, and again that's a void, returns void, and string URL. So in order to build our dispatch method, the couple of stuff that we need to think about. Remember what I was saying, our dispatch method creates our controller objects from the class from the parameters, but we haven't got any parameters at the minute. So we're going to actually implement an helper function that helps us to assign the parameters to our class property params. So I'm going to name this method, make it a private method, because this method will only be used within this class. It won't be used anywhere else. So we're sort of like making it private to this class only. So a private function, and we're going to call this match. And this method returns a bool, or a boolean. It's either true or false. And it takes an argument. It will take an argument, a string argument that says URL, same as our dispatch. And what this method is going to do, this method is going to match any URL that's coming in as an argument to, I'm gonna refer to it as route. Match any route coming in to the routes that we've got in our routing table. So you can imagine if we're defining a route, we define our route using the add method. So if we say this add, we can say http localhost user index. So that's our route. That's what the route will look like. And parameters, we can define parameters as, say, controller, and we can assign that a class. So for example, if this was, we've got a user index, so we can say the controller needs to be point to user. We can say the action needs to point to index. So that's what our parameter look like. It's an associative array. So we set the controller, we set the action, we can set stuff like the namespace, and we can set stuff like ID. So we're saying our controller should look for a class called user, and the action method, or the action for that the action parameter should point to the index method, which is going to be the default method for all of our controller class. So that's our routing table right here. So this route will be assigned to this parameter. So we're saying in our argument, match the incoming route to a route that we've got in our routing table, and if we found a match, we're going to assign the parameters. So we'll say, and because, well, let's write for each this route. Remember, this route is an array, so we can iterate over it. This route as a route params. I'm going to use a regular expression to actually match our routes. So I'm going to say if preg match route URL, and with the preg match method, the third argument is an array. So if we've got a match, we're going to store that params within the third argument, which we're going to assign as matches. Now that variable could be whatever you want it to be. It's, you look around the web and you look at this particular method, the third argument always uses that name matches. So we're going to go with that standard convention. So if preg match route, if we match a route within our routing table, then store that parameters in that matches variable. And because it's an array, we can then iterate over it. So I'm going to say for each matches as key, get the parameter or a param, or assign the param to the key. So all of our parameters should be a string. You know, it's not, there should be no other data type apart from string. So we want to actually enforce that. So if is string key, then we're going to create a new variable called params with that key and assign it to the value of the param. So at this point now, we're going to actually assign our class property to whatever value that key returns. So I'm going to say this params equal params. So we're storing this entire block within our class property. So effectively we could do something like, or we could echo something like echo return, depending on the context you're using it in. Say something like this params key, and the key will be whatever the key is, or whatever the key of that associative array is, which could be controller action ID or namespace. So if we echo something like that, it will return, for example, if we're in a user controller class and we echo this line of code, it will actually echo the name of the class, which will be user, or the name of the controller parameter, which will be user. It won't echo the controller suffix because that suffix is what we added on. It will echo what it pulls from the URL, which is going to be user. If that makes, I hope that makes sense. So if we've got a match, we are assigning the property, we're assigning the params to the actual parameter, and then we're going to return true. Then outside this for each loop, if we've got no match, then simple return false. So that's basically what this method is doing. It's taking in an argument, which is the URL. It's matching it, see if we've got a match in our routing table. If it's got a match, we're going to assign the parameters to that URL, loop through that parameters, and assign the class property those parameters. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're going to say match the route to the route in the routing table, and setting this params property if route is found. And also to note again, guys, not all routes will have a parameter. Some might not have parameters. Some might have just one key in that parameter. It doesn't matter. We're just saying, yeah. So it takes an argument which is a string, which is a URL, and it return a boolean or a bool. Oops. What I've done there, I've closed my program down. What the hell? Right. So now we can actually use this method within our dispatch class. So we can say if this match, and we're passing in the argument coming from the dispatch, because the dispatch is what we're going to be using within our front end, within our bootstrap file. So URL. So if we've got a match URL, we can then start extracting those parameters to build our controller objects on our action method. So I'm going to create a variable, say controller string equal this params controller. So that's one of the key within our parameter controller. So if we've got a match, we can get the controller parameter and we can pull the controller name from that. The next one's going to be controller string is, again, at this point we want to convert the controller string to something like user controller. So we can actually go ahead and actually delegate this to a separate method that's going to help us to convert this controller name to a camel uppercase, and that's another PSR or naming convention. When we name in our class, it's upper camel case. So we start off with a capital, and every consecutive word that comes after that should start with a capital, like what I've just written a while ago. User, the next word controller starts with a capital, and if it's something else, we're going to add a capital like that, and so on and so on. So we can delegate this bit of code to be executed somewhere else within this class. So we can say public function say transform upper camel case, and this takes one argument, which is going to be a string, whatever string that we want to convert or transform, and it's going to return that string, that converted or transformed string. And it's a simple method as return str replace space, close that up, and we're going to use a PHP function called UC words. And if we hover over it, it gives you a nice little description of what it means. It says uppercase the first character of each word in a string, which is exactly what we want. So we're going to say str again, get rid of any hyphens, with a space, and I'm going to pass that argument in. And that's it. That's as far as that method goes. So we can then use this method up here, say this transform upper camel case, and then pass our controller string in, and that's going to convert that string into upper camel case, which is what naming convention that we want to go with. Then we're going to actually get the namespace for that class. And we're going to delegate this to a separate method as well. I'm going to pass in that transform controller name, which is going to be stored in this controller string. So if I come down here, I can actually create that method now. So I'm going to say public function get namespace, accept one argument, which is a string, and it also returns a string. So we need to sort of like define a namespace that where all of our controller files is going to be. And it's not going to be within our frame, in our core framework. It's going to be within our application directory. So we could say something like define that namespace by saying namespace equal app controller. And we need to put two backtick to escape out of that quote. And we're going to use a PHP function that says if array key exists, and we're checking if the namespace key is within our parameters array, params, and if it is, then we can assign or concatenate that namespace onto our actual namespace that we've defined up here. And this dot equal denotes that we concatenating a string on a string. So I'm going to say namespace say this params. I'm going to get the namespace out of the parameter property, or out of this property called params, and we're going to say namespace, and we're going to concatenate on our backticks as well, and then that's it. We're just going to return that namespace, and this is as dynamic as it gets. So we can even allow our front-end application to define their route structure of how they actually want to define their controller namespace. So we can later on we could put this within our app.yaml file, so our application can define that route. But again, we'll leave it like that for now. And self-document is get the namespace for the controller namespace defined within the route parameters only if it was added. Only if it was added. Again, take an argument, which is a string, and it return a string. So close this out. So all we're doing is checking if the namespace key is defined within the parameter. If it is, then we're going to concatenate it onto this string right here. If it's not, then return the default namespace as it is. So back up in our dispatch method, let's finish creating this method. So now we've got our namespace or class namespace. We can actually check using if class exists method. If class exists, controller string, and if the class exists, we can create that object. So we're going to say controller object, which is a new variable I've just created, equal new, the new name, the new key, and controller string. So we're basically saying new user controller. We're instantiating the object or instantiating that class. So once we've got that object, we can sort of like go and define or extract our option or extract our action from the parameter. So I'm going to say action equal this params action, and we also want to convert this into camel case. So our class name is going to use the upper camel case naming convention, and our method going to use a camel case naming convention. So again, just like we did above with the transform upper camel case, we're going to delegate this to a next method outside of this method to undo all of that transformation for us. So we're going to say this, I'm going to say transform camel case, and again that's going to take the action variable, and we can come down here, we can actually create that right away, and it's going to be even simpler. So I was going to say public function and transform camel case. That's going to be a string which returns a string, and it's going to be as simple as lc first. I'm going to pass the function that we created earlier, which is transform upper camel case. I'm going to pass that string in, and that's as easy as it is to transform our action method into camel case naming convention. So we've already declared that method there. So what next bit that we need to do is need to use is callable. So we're checking if that method is callable within that object, because it might not be callable if it's a private or a protected method. It might not be callable. So we're checking that it's callable within that object. So I'm going to say if is callable onto that controller object. If that this keyboard is really starting to wind me up. Controller object method, and if it's callable, we're going to execute that method from the object. Controller object action. The typing is really sort of like doing my editing. It makes me feel like I can't type, but I'm still trying to get used to this keyboard. I'm purely sort of like a laptop. I've been coding on laptops for many years, and making the transformation to desktop, I'm struggling badly with this keyboard. So I might have to look at buying a new one. Right. So if it's callable, then execute that method. If it's not, then we want to return an exception. So we're going to throw new exception, and this is just a standard PHP exception. We can actually use better exception, because PHP's they've got a bunch of different exception that does a lot of different things. But for the time being, I'm going to just put the standard exception there, and we'll address that. We will be addressing that later on. So if the method does not exist, throw an exception. And same for the class. If the class does not exist, we want to also throw an exception. Throw a new exception. And we're going to be throwing one more exception at the very top. So if we've got a route, execute this block of code. If we've not found a route within our routing table, we can throw an exception again. And this is going to be like a 404, page not found. Throw new exception, and that's going to be that for this particular method. So to recap, method takes one argument. We're checking that with this match method, checking that we've got a route that matches a route within our routing table. If we have, we're going to use the parameters of that route to create our controller object. We are transforming it to upper camel case. We're getting the namespace, and we are calling the action method on that object if it's callable. And we're throwing exception if we got a bad method. If it's not found, we're throwing an exception, and we're also throwing an exception if the class does not exist, and we're throwing an exception if no route was found, which will be a 404 page not found error. So that's going to be it for our our router class, which we're going to be revisiting later on, because there's going to be some more stuff that we're going to be adding to this, like our add method. We're going to be adding some regular expression to deal with our dynamic routes. So, but at the minute, this class as itself don't really do much as it is. So we're going to actually jump onto a different part of the framework and start building that out. And again, as I'm saying, there's no particular order in how we do it. Just need to start building it, and when stuff comes up, then we'll turn our attention to that to tackle that a little bit. So the next thing that I want to actually focus on is our database. So again, I'm going to create a database connection interface.php, and the actual database file is going to be database connection.php, and get the database interface class. Again, I'm going to declare strict type equal 1 namespace magma, but this time we're in the database connection directory. So I'm going to say database connection. I'm going to say interface database connection interface. And like our first class that we create, our router, this also has two methods, and it's going to be an open method and a close method. And the open method basically opens or create a database connection, and the close method will close that database connection. And that is the only two methods that we're going to implement within this part of our framework, because as I'm saying, I'm going back to the single responsibility. I only want this class or this part of our framework, the database connection, to create a connection and to close it. That is all I want it to be doing. So the public function open, and this is going to return a PDO object because we're using PHP data object, and it's simple going to say opens or create a new database connection. It takes no argument, but it returns PDO, a PDO object. And second method is close database connection. And this is basically going to be void because it will return nothing. And again, I should take these off because it's an interface, does not have a body. And again, that method does not have an argument. There's no arguments with these two methods. So in our database connection class, we're going to say PHP declare strict type. I know this seems a bit tedious, but we're sort of like following good practice here. And, you know, it's not always nice, but we do this right from the get-go. So namespace magma database connection. It's going to be a class database connection implements database connection interface. And our first protected property that we're going to create is our PDO object. So it's going to be protected PDO assigned to DBH. And second one is going to be an array. Let's be a protected array. I'm going to name that credential or credentials. So the idea behind this second property is that we want to allow our application to inject their database connection string rather than us defining it within our framework. We want to put that bit to the application so they can actually inject their connection string to establish their database connection. So we're going to provide the means to do that. And how we do that is we're going to be creating a constructor method. This will be main constructor class. And again, this is going to return void because it won't return anything. It's just going to assign the argument to the property or pipe the property to the argument. So I'm going to say public function construct, and we're going to say this credentials equal credentials, and we need to create this variable in the constructor, and so it's going to be an array of credentials. And we're not going to assign an empty array because this is going to be a required argument. This argument is required in order to create a database connection. We need these credentials. So I'm going to implement these method. So it's going to inherit from the doc. Say public function open, and again it's going to return a PDO object, and we must bring PDO in. Use PDO. Same in our interface. Use PDO. Just to be explicit. So within our open method, I want to implement a try catch block. So if we develop any sort of error whilst trying to connect to our database, I want to catch that exception or catch that error so we can display it properly to the user. So I'm going to say try catch, and this is how we define a try catch block. I want to actually execute my code within this block. So I'm going to say this dbh equal new PDO, and our credentials property that we got is going to contain our connection string. So on the new line, I'm going to write this credentials and DSN. So the DSN is going to be our connection string, and that contains our database driver, or database name, etc., etc. So within our config file, we're going to have a key that says DSN, and that's going to contain the value for this actual property, DSN. The next key that we want to get from our credential is the username. So I'm going to say username. And the third key, or the third argument of this PDO object, is going to be the password. And that also comes from our credential array. Now there's a fourth argument that we can pass into this PDO object, and that's an optional parameters. So I'm going to say, I can define that list of attribute within this method, or I'm going to do it how I'm doing it, which is to pass in this argument, and I'm going to pass in this argument, and I can define this argument at the top here, and it's going to be an array, and it's going to contain key value pairs. So the first one I'm going to add in is PDO attribute emulate PDO attribute emulate prepares. I'm going to assign that or set that to false. I'm gonna miss a colon here, so colon. The second one is PDO attribute, and it's going to be persistent. And we need to keep our database connection persistent so we can use it throughout. Third one is PDO attribute error mode. I'll set that to PDO error mode exception. So we're forcing PDO to use exception. PDO, and the last one is PDO attribute default fetch mode, and our default fetch mode is going to be fetch assoc, which is fetching an associative array. So this is if we've not defined a fetch mode, this is going to be our default fetch mode. It's going to be fetch assoc. And again, mistake right here. Add that in. Take that off. Still having issues with keyboard. And so this array is going to be passed down into our PDO method or PDO object as the fourth argument. So within here, I'm going to say PDO exception, and assign it that a variable e, or just be explicit, say exception. Now, I've been reading online where it says we should not pass in a PDO exception within our code, but however, I've been over to PHP website and I've been looking into it, and there's an actual workaround which we are going to implement. So we're going to throw a PDO exception and then re-throw it within our own custom exception. So I'm going to actually go in my directory. I'm going to create a new directory called exception, and within that I'm going to create a custom exception. So it's going to be database connection exception .php, and what I'm going to do right here is I am going to create a custom PHP exception, again sticking to the same approach that we've been using throughout. Gonna namespace, and it's gonna be magma database connection, and now we're going into a subdirectory within our database connection directory, and that's going to be the exception directory. Exception. So let's say class, can call it database connection exception, and we're going to extend PDO exception. And let me pass in the use case up here. So it's going to be PDO exception. And what I want to do is I want to set a constructor method and override that constructor. So I'm going to say public function constructor, and I'm going to define two property. It's going to be protected message and code, and I'm going to apply these two arguments to our constructor, which is going to be message, and that's going to equal to null, and code going to equal to null. We're going to pipe these properties to these arguments, to these constructor arguments. And that's going to be it for our custom database exception. So we're just rewriting that PDO exception constructor and passing in our message. So it's going to be throw new database connection exception, and we're going to say exception, which is that variable we created right here. I'm going to say get message, and we're going to pass in exception again, get code. But in order for this to work properly, we need to type in this second argument as an integer. Now we need to bring in a use case, which is going to be Magma. Bring in our exception, going to be database connection database. Sorry, I mean exception. I need to bring our database connection exception. So all we're doing right here is referencing that class that we just created. We're bringing it in, into our main database connection class, so we can make use of it. We're being explicit by bringing all these code in that we need, or bringing all these files that we need. So it's going to be database connection exception. This is so we're not getting any errors. So we're referencing this class right here, bringing it in via namespace. And I think that's it for database connection. So we've established a open connection. That's not it, but we've established a connection with this open method. We're passing in some optional arguments to our PDO object. We're setting all the credentials, all the DSN, username, password, and we're throwing an exception using our custom database exception if we sort of like come across any errors whilst trying to connect. And the second method is going to be pretty simple, because all we're going to do is call null on that database connection. It's going to be this dbh equal null. And again, we're going to inherit doc from our interface, and we're going to call null on this, or void on this method. Now you've noticed that I have not actually add void on the constructor because we're not returning anything. That's because in PHP, constructor hasn't got a return type. So if we leave that right there, we're going to get an error. It's going to error out. So we don't put return type on our constructor. And that's as much as it goes for this database class. Its only purpose is to provide a connection, is to establish a connection and return that through this method. So we can then use this method to get that connection to do something else somewhere else in our framework. So again, single responsibility for this class is to establish a connection. We've got our custom database exception, which we're going to return in case there's an error, and we got a close method that we use to close a connection when we're finished with it, which we'll probably not use this method, but we're going to put it in just in case. So I'm going to close these out. So what I'm going to do now, actually, I'm going to commit this update to GitHub. So I'm going to say git status git add and git commit. Just say we've added our router interface and router class, added the methods, and we also created our database connection class and interface. Commit that, and we're going to push it. And it's going to say git push origin master. And we can check that on GitHub to see if that's been pushed. Drag this page over. So go on to our repository, and here we go. So if you click, get into that, there we go. We got our two classes, or two components in our framework that's been pushed to GitHub. So you guys can actually go and access this, and here it is. It's right there. And we got our router class. So this is all now in the public domain. So you guys can head over. Again, I'll put links down in the description so you can head straight to this code. You can download it, play around with it as we're going along. So we've got that updated to our repo, and that's going to be the end for this particular video. So the next video we're going to jump straight into creating our ORM, because that's going to be like a component by itself. So stay tuned for the next video, guys. It's going to be dropping real soon. Thanks. Bye.